The richest man in the company never noticed her, until she became the only person he couldn't ignore. Ethan Langston was used to being the most important person in any room. As the CEO of Langston Enterprises, he didn't just run the company, he owned it. His employees scrambled to impress him, his investors hung on his every word, and his competitors feared him. That was the way the world worked. At least, that's what he thought. Then there was Lena. Lena had worked at Langston Enterprises for almost 3 years, buried somewhere in the finance department. She was the kind of employee who never drew attention to herself. She didn't gossip in the break room, didn't network at corporate parties, and certainly didn't flatter the boss. She was quiet, efficient, and entirely forgettable. Until the day she wasn't. It happened in the middle of a high-stakes meeting with his executive team. Ethan, dressed in his custom-tailored suit, leaned back in his chair as they reviewed the company's quarterly numbers. Profits were soaring, and Ethan barely listened, until a hesitant voice spoke up from the corner of the room. "Excuse me, sir, but that number is incorrect." The room fell silent. Ethan's sharp gaze snapped toward the speaker. He almost dismissed her outright, but something in the way she gripped her pen, tight, but steady, made him pause. "Lena." She looked up at him, hesitant but firm. The entire boardroom turned to watch. No one ever interrupted Ethan Langston. "What did you say?" His voice was calm, but there was an undeniable edge to it. Lena cleared her throat. "There's an error in the projected revenue model. The numbers don't account for the supplier cost increase. If we proceed with these calculations, the company will lose over $10 million in 6 months." A murmur rippled through the room. Ethan's executives exchanged uneasy glances, silently hoping their boss wouldn't explode. Ethan studied her, his mind racing. He wasn't used to being corrected, especially not in front of others. But instead of irritation, something else stirred in him. Curiosity. His jaw tightened. "Show me." Lena hesitated for only a second before stepping forward, flipping open her notes, and pointing at the mistake. As she explained the miscalculation, Ethan realized she was right. Embarrassingly right. His executives scrambled to adjust the figures, and for the first time, Ethan looked at Lena properly. She wasn't seeking attention. She wasn't even looking at him anymore. She was just doing her job. The meeting ended, and Lena quietly returned to her seat as if nothing had happened. But Ethan couldn't shake the thought. She had challenged him. Not with arrogance or ambition, just certainty. That night, as he sat in his penthouse overlooking the city, Ethan found himself thinking about her. Lena. Why had he never noticed her before? And why, now, couldn't he stop? Ethan Langston was a man who rarely let things go. Mistakes, inefficiencies, and, most of all, people who challenged him. Yet, as the days passed, his mind kept drifting back to Lena. It wasn't just that she had been right in that meeting. It was how she had spoken, calm, confident, with no trace of arrogance or self-importance. She hadn't tried to impress him. She hadn't expected anything in return. That was new. At first, he convinced himself it was just curiosity. A small mystery to be solved. After all, he knew everything about his top executives, their strengths, their weaknesses, even their personal habits. But Lena? She had been invisible until the moment she wasn't. And now, Ethan needed to know more. A subtle test. The next morning, Ethan made an unexpected appearance on the finance floor. It was rare for him to leave his executive suite unless necessary, and his presence sent a ripple of quiet panic through the department. Employees sat up straighter, typing faster, hoping to avoid his scrutiny. Lena didn't even look up. He stopped by her desk, hands in his pockets. "Lena, isn't it?" She glanced up, expression neutral. "Yes, sir." Ethan ignored the way her eyes briefly flickered with caution. He placed a file on her desk, an internal audit report. This came across my desk. I want a second opinion before I sign off. Lena hesitated. Not because she was nervous, but because she seemed genuinely puzzled. Isn't this something the audit team handles? Ethan shrugged. Maybe. But I want your take. A silent test. Would she hesitate? Would she back down? She didn't. Lena flipped through the pages, her brow furrowing as she studied the data. After a moment, she tapped her pen against the paper. Page 12, this expense report has a discrepancy. It doesn't match last quarter's projections. Ethan felt a slow smirk form on his lips. She didn't just see numbers. She understood them. Interesting. A corporate event changes everything. A week later, the company held its annual investor gala, an extravagant event filled with high-profile clients, CEOs, and financial moguls. Ethan, as always, was the centerpiece of the night, seamlessly navigating between conversations, charming investors, and making powerful deals over champagne. And then he saw her. Lena stood near the edge of the room, wearing a simple black dress, her hands clasped together as she quietly observed the crowd. She wasn't mingling, wasn't trying to impress anyone, just standing there, as if she didn't belong. Ethan watched as a few executives near her laughed loudly, ignoring her presence entirely. It annoyed him. Without thinking, he walked over, breaking away from his conversation with a billionaire investor. "Lena," he said smoothly. She looked up, startled. "Mr. Langston?" Ethan gestured toward the table where the top executives and VIPs Saturday joined me. The nearby conversation stilled. A few heads turned in surprise. Lena blinked. I don't think. I insist," he interrupted. For the first time since he met her, Lena looked flustered. She opened her mouth as if to protest, but then her gaze flickered to the room, to the people who had ignored her, the ones who never paid her any attention. Then she did something Ethan didn't expect. She smiled politely and said, "No, thank you." The silence was deafening. Ethan's expression didn't change, but inside, something shifted. No one turned him down. No one ever refused an invitation to sit at his table. Yet Lena had just done so, effortlessly, without hesitation. And for the first time in years, Ethan Langston was left speechless. Ethan Langston was a man who thrived on control. He controlled his company, his employees, and, until now, every social interaction he had ever engaged in. But Lena? She had just turned him down without a second thought. It bothered him. Not because of arrogance, he had enough power and wealth that one rejection didn't wound his ego. No, it was because he couldn't figure her out. Why had she said no? She wasn't trying to prove a point, wasn't playing games, wasn't testing him. She had simply declined. Like his status, his influence, didn't matter. It was the first time in years he felt insignificant. And he wasn't sure he liked it. A challenge he didn't expect. The gala ended, and Ethan went back to his world of high-stakes business deals, luxury, and control. He told himself Lena was just an employee, someone whose talent he had overlooked, nothing more. But that should have been the end of it. Instead, he found himself paying attention in ways he never had before. Lena didn't seek out promotions. She wasn't interested in office politics. While others fought to be noticed, she simply worked. And she was good at it. A week later, during a board meeting, an issue arose with a merger deal, a deal worth hundreds of millions. Ethan's executives were throwing out solutions, but none of them seemed viable. Then, in a quiet voice from the back of the room, Lena spoke. Why not renegotiate the equity structure instead of overpaying for majority control? Once again, the room stilled. Ethan's head snapped toward her. Explain. Lena swallowed but didn't falter. The company we're acquiring isn't as profitable as they claim. If we delay the buyout and let their financial pressure build, they'll lower their asking price within 3 months. You'll get a better deal and still maintain leverage." A slow smirk formed on Ethan's face. She was right. Again. He held her gaze for a moment, then turned to his executives. "Do what she said." Murmurs filled the room. The CFO nodded, making a note. The entire board had just witnessed what was happening. Lena wasn't just smart. She was strategic. And Ethan? He was intrigued. Pushing limits. For the next few weeks, Ethan watched Lena closely. He started giving her more responsibility, subtly at first, testing how she handled pressure. Each time, she rose to the occasion. But she never sought credit. Never asked for more. Ethan had never met someone so competent and so uninterested in recognition. And that irritated him. Why? Because he wanted to know what motivated her. One evening, he found himself working late in his office when he noticed the dim glow of a desk lamp across the floor. Lena. She was still there, typing away, completely lost in her work. Ethan walked over. "You're still here." She looked up, startled, then quickly composed herself. "Just finishing a report." Ethan glanced at the screen. "It's past 9. Lena shrugged. "I don't mind." That answer only deepened his curiosity. "Lena," he said, leaning against her desk, "you could be running your own division by now. Why haven't you applied for a promotion?" She hesitated. For the first time, Ethan saw something flicker across her face, something guarded. "It's not about that," she said simply. He frowned. "Then what is it about?" A pause. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Some of us don't work for power. We work because people are counting on us." Ethan studied her, sensing there was more beneath the surface. But before he could press, Lena stood, gathering her things. "Good night, Mr. Langston." She left before he could say another word. And for the first time, Ethan found himself wondering not what Lena wanted, but who she was doing all of this for. And why it mattered to him so much. Ethan Langston was used to reading people. In business, in negotiations, in life, he could spot a person's motives within seconds. But Lena? She was an enigma. She worked late, handled complex problems with ease, and never sought recognition. She didn't fear him, didn't flatter him, and, most frustratingly, didn't seem to care about his attention. And yet, for reasons he couldn't explain, he cared about hers. A silent shift. Over the next few weeks, Ethan found himself gravitating toward her. At meetings, his gaze would flicker to her whenever a new problem arose. She wasn't always the first to speak, but when she did, it was with precision. No wasted words. No unnecessary bravado. He wasn't the only one who noticed. One evening, at a boardroom discussion, a senior executive scoffed after Lena made a suggestion. "Bold move, sweetheart," the man muttered under his breath, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. Ethan felt something in his chest tighten. Lena, as always, didn't react. She simply nodded, as if she hadn't heard. But Ethan had. And he didn't like it. Before he could stop himself, his voice cut through the room. "She's right," he said coolly. "And if you were half as competent as she is, we wouldn't be in this situation in the first place." Silence. The executive paled, stammering an apology. Ethan didn't even look at him. His gaze was on Lena, who was staring at him with something unreadable in her expression. For the first time, she looked genuinely surprised. And for the first time, Ethan realized he liked defending her. A late-night revelation. That night, long after the offices emptied, Ethan remained behind. He sat at his desk, unable to focus. Something was happening. Something he didn't understand. Lena had gotten under his skin. He didn't admire her just for her intelligence, he admired her restraint, her patience, her quiet resilience. And that terrified him. He was Ethan Langston. He wasn't the kind of man who admired people. He was the kind of man who controlled them. So why was he losing control? A knock at his office door startled him from his thoughts. Lena stood in the doorway, her hands clasped in front of her. Ethan sat up. "What are you still doing here?" She hesitated, then stepped inside. "I should be asking you the same thing." For a moment, there was silence. Then, Lena sighed. "I wanted to say, thank you. For earlier." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "You don't need to thank me. I only said the truth." A small, wry smile flickered across her face. "Maybe. But no one's ever stood up for me before." That admission sent an unexpected pang through him. No one? Before he could ask, Lena's gaze dropped, and she hesitated. Then, in a voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, she said, "Sometimes it's easier to be invisible. People can't hurt what they don't notice." The words were casual, but Ethan recognized the weight behind them. She had been overlooked, dismissed, and pushed aside for so long that she had chosen invisibility. And suddenly, Ethan wanted to know why. A moment of vulnerability. He didn't think, he just spoke. "Who are you working so hard for?" Lena blinked, caught off guard. "You don't chase promotions," Ethan continued. "You don't care about recognition. But you stay late, you push yourself harder than anyone else." "Why?" Lena hesitated. Then, finally, she said, "My father." Ethan tilted his head. "He was an accountant," she explained, her voice softer now. "He used to tell me that numbers never lied, that if you looked closely enough, they'd tell you a story. He taught me everything I know." There was warmth in her voice, but something else, too. Sadness. Ethan stayed quiet, sensing there was more. Lena inhaled deeply, then said, "He's sick. Has been for years. Medical bills, they don't wait. So I work. And I don't have time to care about things like promotions or recognition. I just need to make sure he's okay." Ethan felt something stir in his chest. He had spent his entire career chasing power, money, and control. Lena was chasing survival. And for the first time in a long, long time, Ethan Langston felt small. The unspoken decision. Lena exhaled, rubbing her forehead. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have." "Don't apologize," Ethan said. His voice was firm but quiet. Lena met his gaze, searching for something in his expression. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded. Then she turned to leave. Ethan watched her go, his mind racing. Something in him shifted that night. He couldn't explain it, couldn't define it, but it was there. Lena had spent her entire life being invisible. And Ethan? He had just decided he wasn't going to let that happen anymore. Ethan Langston had spent his life chasing control. He built his empire through power, precision, and an unshakable belief that everything in the world had a price. But Lena? Lena had just proven to him that some things were priceless. And now, for the first time in years, Ethan found himself doing something completely out of character. He wanted to help. Anonymity and good intentions. The morning after their conversation, Ethan couldn't focus. Lena's words echoed in his mind, "I just need to make sure he's okay." Without thinking twice, he made a call to his personal assistant. "I need details on Lena's father, his medical history, his expenses, everything." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Sir?" Ethan rarely explained himself, and he wasn't about to start now. "Just do it." Hours later, the report landed on his desk. The numbers were staggering. Years of medical bills, mounting debt, and a household barely holding itself together. It made Ethan sick to his stomach. He had spent millions on luxury, on investments, on things that meant nothing. Meanwhile, Lena, one of the brightest minds in his company, was drowning. That night, Ethan made a decision. He paid off the entire debt. Every bill, every overdue notice, every future expense. Quietly. Anonymously. It was the first time in his life he had ever used his wealth not to gain something, but to give. And it felt different. Maybe even right. The fallout. Ethan expected Lena to be relieved. He expected her to find out, to feel a weight lifted from her shoulders. Maybe she'd even look at him differently, finally see that he wasn't just a ruthless businessman. But what he didn't expect was for her to storm into his office the next day, eyes blazing with fury. "What did you do?" Ethan looked up from his desk, caught completely off guard. "Lena?" She slammed an envelope onto his desk. "Tell me you didn't do this." Ethan's eyes flickered to the documents. Hospital statements. Payment confirmations. His chest tightened. She knew. Lena's voice trembled. "You paid off my father's medical bills." Ethan leaned back in his chair, unreadable. "Yes." Silence. Lena's jaw clenched. "Why?" Ethan stared at her for a long moment. "Because I could." Her breath hitched, and for a brief second, something flickered in her eyes, something that looked dangerously close to betrayal. And then, to his complete shock, she shook her head. "You had no right." Ethan frowned. "I was helping you." "No," she said firmly. "You were fixing me. Like I was some kind of charity case." Her words hit harder than he expected. "I never asked for this," she whispered. "Do you have any idea how hard I've worked? How much I've sacrificed?" Ethan's throat tightened. "Lena, You just erased it. Like it didn't matter." Her voice cracked, and Ethan felt something sharp twist in his chest. He had wanted to do something good. He had wanted to make things easier for her. Instead, he had humiliated her. Lena inhaled sharply, blinking back what looked suspiciously like tears. She shook her head again, this time, with finality. "I can't do this." Ethan stiffened. "Do what?" Lena swallowed hard. "Work here. Work for you." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. "I quit." Ethan stood abruptly. "Lena, wait." But she was already walking away. For the first time in his life, Ethan Langston had all the money, power, and influence in the world. And none of it was enough to stop her from leaving. Ethan Langston had closed billion-dollar deals, crushed competitors, and built an empire from the ground up. But as he sat in his empty office, staring at the resignation letter in his hands, he realized something terrifying. For the first time in his life, he had lost an empty space. It had been a week since Lena walked out. A week since she had looked him in the eye and told him she was done. A week since Ethan had felt a strange, foreign emptiness settle in his chest. At first, he convinced himself it didn't matter. Employees came and went, it was the nature of business. She was just another name in the system. But then he started noticing things. The finance department felt quieter. The efficiency wasn't the same. Meetings dragged longer because no one was brave enough to point out the errors Lena had caught so effortlessly. And worst of all, he missed her. Not just her work. Not just her intelligence. Her. The way she challenged him. The way she never tried to impress him. The way she made him see things differently, even when he didn't want to. He had spent years thinking power made him untouchable. Now, he realized power meant nothing when the one person who saw him differently wanted nothing to do with him. The deal that should have mattered. A month later, Ethan sat in a high-rise conference room, sealing the biggest merger of his career. The deal was worth billions. His investors were celebrating, shaking hands, toasting to success. Ethan barely heard them. He had spent years chasing this: more wealth, more power, more control. And yet, as he looked at the contract in front of him, all he could think about was the way Lena had stared at him that day. Her voice breaking as she said, "You just erased it. Like it didn't matter." He had never understood what she meant. But now, looking at his empty life, his hollow victories, he did. A familiar face. One evening, on his way home from work, Ethan stopped at a small cafe. He never went to places like this, too modest, too simple, too ordinary. But tonight, he found himself stepping inside, drawn by something he couldn't explain. And that's when he saw her. Lena. Sitting by the window, laptop open, typing away like she hadn't just walked out of his life and taken something vital with her. For a moment, he considered leaving. But something in him, something desperate, kept him rooted to the spot. Before he could second-guess himself, he walked over. She looked up, and when their eyes met, Ethan's heart did something it had never done before. It stumbled. Lena blinked in surprise. "Mr. Langston?" Hearing her say his name again, even if it was formal, was like a punch to the gut. He cleared his throat. "It's just Ethan." A flicker of something crossed her face, but it was gone too fast to read. "What are you doing here?" she asked, closing her laptop. Ethan hesitated. What was he doing here? He stopped, exhaled. "I saw you." Lena tilted her head. And suddenly, the boardrooms, the billion-dollar deals, the relentless chase for more, none of it mattered. He sat down across from her. "Lena," he swallowed, forcing himself to say the words that felt impossible. "I messed up." Her expression didn't change. "I know." That made him chuckle, even though nothing about this was funny. "I thought I was helping," he admitted. "But I wasn't. I didn't get it before, but I do now." She studied him for a long moment, as if searching for something. Then, quietly, she said, "And what exactly do you get, Ethan?" The way she said his name sent a strange warmth through him. He met her gaze, no longer the arrogant CEO, no longer the man who thought he could fix everything with money. "I get that I was wrong." Silence. Ethan exhaled. "And I get that I don't want to be that man anymore." Lena's lips parted slightly, but she didn't speak. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Langston wasn't trying to close a deal. He was just waiting. Waiting for the one thing he had never needed before. A second chance. Ethan Langston had spent his entire life mastering the art of persuasion. He could close billion-dollar deals, convince hardened investors to back his ventures, and manipulate markets with a few strategic moves. But sitting across from Lena in that tiny cafe, he realized something terrifying. None of that mattered here. Because for the first time, he wasn't negotiating power. He was asking for forgiveness. A different kind of conversation. Lena stared at him, her expression unreadable. "Why are you here, Ethan?" she asked quietly. He exhaled. "Because I need to say something." And because, he hesitated, then admitted, "I miss you." Something flickered in her eyes, surprise, maybe even something softer, but she didn't respond. Ethan leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "I messed up," he continued. "I thought money could fix everything. That if I just solved your problem, it would somehow mean something." Lena's jaw tightened. "But it didn't." "No," he agreed. "Because I didn't fix anything. I just took away your choice. That made her pause. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, something he only did when he was really frustrated with himself. The truth is, I didn't just do it for you. Lena frowned. What do you mean? He exhaled. I did it because it made me feel better. Because for the first time, I wanted to do something that wasn't about power or profit. But I didn't think about what you needed. Only what I wanted to do. A long silence stretched between them. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Lena said, "That's the first honest thing you've said to me." Ethan's chest tightened. Then let me be even more honest. Lena met his gaze. I don't just miss working with you, he admitted. I miss you. Her breath hitched slightly, but she covered it quickly. Ethan. No, just let me say this. His voice was quieter now, raw in a way it had never been before. You were the only person who ever looked at me like I was more than a CEO. More than a name on a list of the richest men in the country. Lena swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. Ethan's voice softened. And I think, that scared me. Because I don't know who I am when I'm not those things. Lena blinked, as if processing his words. Ethan let out a self-deprecating chuckle. And now I sound pathetic. To his surprise, Lena shook her head. No. He looked at her, unsure. No? Lena sighed, glancing out the window for a long moment before finally turning back to him. I didn't quit because you paid my father's bills, Ethan. He frowned. Then why? She hesitated, then admitted, because I didn't want to owe you. Ethan felt something inside him crack. Because if I stayed, Lena continued, her voice softer now, I wouldn't have just been an employee. I would have been someone you saved. And I don't want to be that person to you. Ethan swallowed. Lena. I wanted you to see me as an equal, she finished. Not someone you had to fix. And there it was. The real reason. Ethan had spent his entire life being the one in control, the one making decisions, the one who held the power. But for the first time, he understood. It had never been about money. It had been about respect. And he had taken that from her. A different proposal. Ethan took a slow breath, his mind clearer than it had ever been. I want to fix this, he said. Lena shook her head. You can't just fix everything, Ethan. I know. He met her eyes. That's why I'm not trying to. She hesitated. I don't want to offer you your job back, he said slowly. I don't want to offer you anything. I just want to ask. Lena raised a brow. Ask what? Ethan leaned forward slightly. What do you want, Lena? Her lips parted slightly, caught off guard. Ethan continued, for the first time, I'm not going to assume I know. I'm not going to decide for you. Just tell me what you actually want. Lena was quiet for a long moment. Then, finally, she said, I want to build something on my own. Ethan felt something in his chest loosen. Then let me help you this time, he said. Not by paying for it. Not by throwing money at the problem. Just by standing beside you. Lena studied him carefully. And if I fail? Ethan smiled, something genuine and rare. Then we'll figure it out together. The choice. Lena exhaled slowly, as if processing everything. Then, to Ethan's complete surprise, she smiled. A real smile. The kind he hadn't seen before. Okay, she said. Ethan blinked. Okay? Lena nodded. Let's see if you're as good at listening as you are at talking. Ethan let out a quiet chuckle. You have no idea what you just signed up for. Lena smirked. Neither do you. And just like that. Ethan Langston, the man who had always gotten his way, had just won something he never saw coming. Not a deal. Not a promotion. Something real. Something worth keeping. Ethan Langston was not a patient man. He was used to immediate results, sealing deals with a handshake, watching stocks rise overnight, getting exactly what he wanted when he wanted it. But with Lena? For the first time in his life, he realized that some things had to be earned. And that terrified him. Walking a different path. After their conversation in the cafe, Ethan did something even he didn't expect. He let go. No grand gestures. No controlling moves. No attempts to pull her back into his world. Instead, he waited. And watched. And for the first time in his life, he let someone else take the lead. Lena's rise. Lena didn't go back to Langston Enterprises. Instead, she built something of her own. It started as a small financial consulting firm, helping small businesses navigate the kind of corporate red tape that Ethan's world thrived on. Ethan saw the headlines. Ex-Langston employee launches firm, shakes up industry with new approach. At first, he told himself he was just curious. Then, he realized he was proud. She had done it. She had built something that was hers. And for the first time, Ethan felt something foreign and unfamiliar. Admiration. Not for a competitor. Not for an ally. For Lena. And that was when he knew. He couldn't go back to who he was before. The CEO's final move. A month later, the corporate world went into chaos. Ethan Langston stepped down as CEO of Langston Enterprises. The headlines exploded. Billionaire walks away, why would a man with everything just quit? Speculations ran wild. Was he sick? Had he lost his mind? Was there a scandal? Ethan didn't care. For the first time in his life, he had nothing to prove. And that was the most powerful feeling of all. The reunion. Ethan showed up at Lena's office unannounced. Her assistant nearly fell out of his chair when he saw Ethan Langston standing at the front desk, dressed casually, hands in his pockets. Lena looked up when he walked in. At first, her expression was unreadable. Then, slowly, she smiled. "You're insane," she said. Ethan smirked. "That's old news." Lena shook her head. "You really quit?" Ethan shrugged. "Turns out, running the world isn't as fun when you're the only one at the top." She studied him for a long moment. "And now?" Ethan leaned against the doorframe, completely at ease. "Now, I want to know if you have room in your company for an ex-CEO with terrible people skills." Lena raised an eyebrow. Ethan Langston, asking for a job? He grinned. "No. I'm asking if you'd let me stand beside you this time." Lena exhaled slowly. Then, to his complete surprise, she stepped forward. And hugged him. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't dramatic. It was real. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Langston had something no amount of money could buy. Peace. For most of his life, Ethan Langston believed success was measured by power, wealth, and control. He had built an empire. He had shaped industries. He had been the kind of man people feared, admired, and envied. But standing in Lena's office, for the first time in his life, he felt like a man worth respecting. Not because of what he owned. But because of who he had chosen to become. A new chapter. The corporate world was still reeling from Ethan's decision to step down. Investors panicked. Reporters speculated. Yet, Ethan had never felt lighter. He had spent years running toward something, more power, more money, more control, without ever stopping to ask why. Now, for the first time, he had no title. No empire. And he had never been happier. A different kind of partnership. Lena's company was thriving. What had started as a small consulting firm had grown faster than even she expected. Small businesses, independent entrepreneurs, people who had been crushed by the same systems Ethan once controlled, were finally getting a fair shot. And Ethan? He didn't take over. He didn't dictate strategy. He simply helped. Not as a CEO. Not as a billionaire. Just as Ethan. Lena, as always, made sure he worked for it. "You're really going to let me run spreadsheets?" he grumbled one afternoon, staring at the data in front of him. Lena smirked. "You're the one who said you wanted to stand beside me, remember?" Ethan rolled his eyes. "I didn't think that meant being your intern." She leaned against the desk, arms crossed. Ethan Langston, ex-billionaire, scared of a little hard work? He glanced at her, then chuckled. "You enjoy this, don't you?" She grinned. "Maybe a little." And to his own surprise, Ethan enjoyed it too. Not because of the work. But because for the first time, he was building something that actually mattered. The final lesson. Months passed. Lena's company continued to grow, and with it, so did Ethan. One evening, they stood on the rooftop of their office, looking out over the city. The same skyline Ethan had once ruled, now a place of possibility instead of control. Lena turned to him. "You ever regret it?" Ethan raised a brow. "Regret what?" "Walking away." Ethan thought about it. Thought about the boardrooms, the headlines, the billions of dollars in deals. Then he turned to her, a small smile forming. "No," he said simply. "Because for the first time, I didn't just build an empire." Lena tilted her head. "What did you build, then?" Ethan exhaled, the weight of his old life finally gone. A life. And for the first time in years, he felt whole. Final message and life lesson. White heavy checkmark success isn't about control, it's about knowing when to let go. White heavy checkmark respect can't be bought, it has to be earned. White heavy checkmark true power isn't in wealth, it's in choosing the kind of person you want to be. Final line. Ethan Langston had spent his life chasing the world. But in the end, he had finally found something worth keeping.